Hello, and thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Carol Jenkins. The program is Black America, and today we have the pleasure of talking with an extraordinary team of artists, mother and son artists, brilliant in their separate careers and even more brilliant together. Dr. Deborah Willis is the chair of the Department of Photography and Imaging at the Tisch School of the Arts and Department of Social and Cultural Analysis. That becomes very important in our conversation, at New York University. She's an esteemed photographer and the author of probably 100 books, but she's admitting to 30, perhaps 30. Her son, prolific and widely praised concept artist and photographer, Hank Willis Thomas, and together and separately, they have new projects and a lot to talk about today. Thank you both so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
So I want to, I'm going to pick up Hank's book first, and because I told him that I'm doing my morning exercises with this. It is such a fantastic compilation, and I can't believe that it's a retrospective of 20 years, 2 decades of your work, your baby to all of us. But one of the things that I love about it is that it's got 2 essays, one by Sarah Elizabeth Lewis and one by Kelly Jones, friends of the family, and especially the interview with Kelly, where she's been on the show, cultural art critic. She talks about the 2 of you in your younger years and of how growing up in your mother's life and work, you said you never wanted to be an artist because they were all broke. A misconception in today's life. Talk to us a little bit about that. First, Deborah, your perspective of this little boy, and we see pictures of him following you around in your workplace, and then we'll get Hank's reaction to it.
Yeah, it was fun growing up in the 80s with Hank, and I worked as a curator at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and also curating shows at the Studio Museum in Harlem, and having the opportunity. We didn't have, quote, as they say, latchkey kids at the time, because we had to work, and Hank had to go to school, and after school, he was with me helping to install exhibitions, doing his homework, and having the exchange to sit at the feet of, from Gordon Parks to James Baldwin to all of the people who visited the Schomburg Center. So it was a central place for him to grow and to be nurtured.
Right, and Hank, as I understand it, you took all of this sort of nonchalantly, or is that?
Yeah, well, there were a lot of kids at the Schomburg, especially, and we took it as an opportunity just to get together with our friends. We called ourselves the Schomburg Kids, and played in all the stacks and the archives, not realizing that we were surrounded by precious gems of American culture.
So also and I want to make sure that I give the title, All Things Being Equal, which they are precisely not, which the title of your book and so much of your art, which tends to emphasize that. Sarah says that, quotes you as saying that all art is political. Talk to us a little bit from both perspectives, both of you examining so much of our history and our life, and do you both perceive it to be political, or civic is another way that it's described? Deborah?
I always think of art as storytelling, and the storytellings could be personal and political. And so with using the medium of photography, we have a breadth of entries into the experience of politics. And I think that that's why visually it's really important to think about art as a storytelling moment, specifically for today, right now. Yeah.
Right. Hank?
Yeah, well, one of the things I learned through my mother's work and her career is that the personal is political. In my mother's book, Posing Beauty, she talks about beauty being a political statement. It was an oxymoron at a time not that long ago for someone to say they were Black and beautiful, and for Black people to claim beauty as something that can be used to describe them was a political act. And My grandmother worked in, was a beautician and had a beauty salon in her home. And this collective personal affirmation and communal affirmation of Black beauty is something that we are only now just beginning to politically appreciate across the world.
Well, we've been watching this fantastic TED Talk that the two of you did together, tremendously popular online. Let's go to a clip of that because it talks, you both are talking some about the beauty and understanding that and appreciating that. Let's look at that now.
My friend Chris Johnson told me that every photographer, every artist is essentially trying to answer one question. And I think your question might have been, why doesn't the rest of the world see how beautiful we are? And what can I do to help them see our community the way I do?
While studying art school, which is probably true, I had a male professor who told me that I was taking up a good man's space. He tried to stifle my dream of becoming a photographer. He attempted to shame me in a class full of male photographers. He told me I was out of place and out of order as a woman. And he went on to say that all you could and would do was to have a baby when a good man could have had your seat in this class. I was shocked into silence into that experience. But I had my camera, and I was determined to prove to him that I was worthy for a seat in that class. But in retrospect, I asked myself, why did I need to prove it to him? You know, I had my camera, and I knew I needed to prove to myself that I would make a difference in photography. I love photography, and no one was going to stop me from making images.
But that's when I came in.
Yeah. That year I graduated, I got pregnant. Yep, he was right.
So I want to talk a little bit about your working together. Why don't we just start with Patti Labelle, which was a sensation in the fashion and music and popular world. You two worked together as photographers to get images of her that were just stunning. And you're both credited as photographers. Talk to us a little bit about how that happened and how you worked together.
Hank, you want to start?
Sure. Well, we were contacted by T Magazine, and they asked us as a pair to photograph Patti Labelle for a cover featuring the divas of music, which included Barbra Streisand and Dolly Parton and Patti Labelle. And my mother, Patti Labelle has been an idol and icon since my childhood, and so it was just really awesome to be invited to do a collaboration like that with her.
Yeah, growing up in Philadelphia, Patti Labelle was our sister icon that we loved. We danced to her music, we cleaned up to her music, we fell in love with her music. So just in terms of that experience, I was heightened, and the opportunity, and also I've been photographing closets. One of my last projects is photographing people's closets, which focuses on memory, and going into her closet, to see the clothing from Labelle and from the shoes and all of the things that she maintained as a storyteller of music and life, and just to have that experience was fun. She's a grandmother, she's a mother, and we felt all of that. And then she's a mentor to a number of people. So all of that was embraced in what we spent the time with photographing her.
Right.
And
well,
she has her cooking.
I know she does.
She shared some pies with us, so that was fun.
She does everything, and she's really inspired me. She is so good as a blonde. I mean, I have always said, before it's all over, I want to be blonde. And after looking at those photographs, and when I do it, then you all have to come back and at least get one photo of me as a blonde. But it was just sensational. Now, Deborah, you have yet. I wanted to say, I don't know how many new books out, but the one I want to talk about right now is The Black Civil War Soldier: A Visual History of Conflict and Citizenship. I don't know, you guys are going to send me broke, if I try to keep up with everything that you publish. But talk to us about your work. This was so interesting to see that Frederick Douglass inspired a lot of the photography that was done during the Civil War, the first time that cameras were actually used to the great extent or were available. Tell us a little bit about your coming to this project and what you found. Just so beautiful with the photographs and the letters that accompany.
I was interested, just in terms of my own educational experience. I was uninformed about the activities of the Civil War soldiers, specifically Black Civil War soldiers who were interested in fighting for their own freedom and their brothers and sisters' freedom. I was interested not only in the memory, from the public memory, it's lacking, but in the personal memories that we know from family histories and from collectors, we know that they existed. I felt it was important. I started a project about 10 years ago, and I felt it was important to create a book, find letters that could relate to the experiences of the war, and find diary pages to include in it. So I found about 100 photographs that I'd wanted to include. There are tons of letters in the archives from the pension records where women are trying to obtain their pensions from their husbands who died, who were injured, trying to prove their worthiness as widows and that aspect of it. But also the words of Frederick Douglass that we overlooked over my studies in history, that he talked about the importance of once a soldier has the U.S. brass button on his lapel, that he is a citizen. He knows that he is fighting for his freedom and for freedom for others. But to listen and to hear the words of, read the words of Frederick Douglass was central to me reimagining the men going into the photographic studio for their own reflection, but also for their families.
It's very, very moving. And to know that there is so much of it that had not been touched yet, and you went in and found it and put it together. So it was over 10 years.
10 years. Project. When you have a chance, read page 188. There's a chaplain who encounters his mother, he was sold off into slavery as a child. His mother searched for 20 years. And she happens to see him on the streets in Richmond. And that story, when she asked questions about his life, where was he taken from, who was his master, who was sold, and then he says, "Garland, this is your mother."
Wow.
It gives me chills to connect to that story. And those stories they were journalists who published. Black journalists who published in the newspapers. There were letters that were sent to newspapers. So there's the entry points in terms of finding the way to tell their stories was multiple and moving.
Right. I highly recommend it. It is so, just the faces. The faces are incredible.
Mm-hmm.
The pride, interesting ones, the soldier and his servant side by side.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the Black Civil War soldier. Please look at that. But now here's another one. More exercise I get here, from this is to make their own way in the world, the enduring legacy of the Zealy daguerreotypes. This is a story that I had missed, that these early, I think we've all seen some of these early photographs of slaves, enslaved people in various stages of undress and abject exposure. Talk to us about the ownership of these photographs and the controversy. You have a wonderful interview with Carrie Mae Weems in the book, but the ownership of those photographs.
Yeah, I was a student in '76 when the photographs were discovered in the attic at the Peabody Museum and at Harvard. I remember clearly the newspaper articles. It was the New York Times and the excitement of discovering these images. And, hence in the 80s, there were articles about the images of Drana, Renti, the Blacks who were born enslaved here in this country and who survived the Middle Passage. So there are 17 daguerreotypes. They're in the collection of the Peabody, based on the fact that Louis Agassiz believed that Black people were inferior, he hired a photographer in South Carolina, J.T. Zealy, to prove his theory by photographing them. But everyone can see that he missed he missed that because
Right.
their humanness is found in those photos.
Precisely.
Yeah. So that's a
Precisely.
way of really looking at that history in a different way. The book came together as a way of 20 people over time have been writing about these daguerreotypes and the experience of working with them. And as a result, the Peabody Museum and Harvard University and Aperture came together to publish all of the essays.
Great, great. Well, it's another wonderful contribution. Now, speaking of contributions, Hank, extraordinary work spanning, I cannot tell you it's so interesting. So there is I Am a Man for one thing, putting a stake in the ground for, a concept. I love, you're saying that what you knew about that was I am the man, and, as opposed to I am a man. Talk to us a little bit about that exhibit and how powerful and really influential that's been in the art world and generally.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, so as many people know, in 1968, during the Memphis Sanitation Workers March for equal rights and to end segregation in the workplace, there were people who carried signs saying, I am a man. And that was also, unfortunately, the protest where Martin Luther King was assassinated when he was down in Memphis in support of that. And the famous photograph by Ernest Withers of dozens of men holding this sign saying, I am a man, really resonated with me throughout my childhood. And of course, it's become pretty iconic of the civil rights movement. And it occurred to me around the 50th anniversary of that the phrase that I grew up with after integration wasn't I am a man as a collective statement, it was I am the man. And I found it so curious that in such a short period of time, it went from a collective communal statement to an apparently selfish statement about self-aggrandizement and maybe implicating ourselves in being the oppressor and being the man. And then I decided I wanted to remix that phrase, I am, thinking about Jesse Jackson and I am somebody, but also thinking about just the power of the words I am to be prophetic and to really say, locate myself and define my reality. And so we did I'm the man, who's the man, you the man, what a man, ain't I a woman? But the final words of the series of paintings is I am a man. And that was really the blessing that was given to us through the women in my family, but especially my grandmother and her mother and aunts, who taught the children that they were with that we had a privilege in just being able to say I am, and that was a blessing that we should be grateful for. And so that's something that I hope to translate in the work.
The mix of your work is so interesting. Talk with us about, there's photography, there are images, and what you've done, which is so interesting, is taken photographs that we know, and spelling them differently, bringing them up to date. Talk to us about what is that process called? Certainly extremely valuable for rethinking things that are part of the psyche. For instance, the people yelling at the students integrating, pulling them out of that background and highlighting them. Well, I'll let you explain all of that, but such great work.
Thank you. Well, as my mom expressed, I did grow up in the archives, and there are a lot of academics writing papers and books and doing research about the visual culture and the legacy of slavery and protest and struggle for equality in general in the United States and across the world. There isn't as much of a landscape or even a method for doing that as a visual artist. There have been always, of course, artists commenting on moments and iconic moments in history. Most famously, I think, in the civil rights movement, ironically, it was Andy Warhol. His race riots paintings, photographs using images from Alabama.
Right.
But with the retrospective opportunity that we have, I felt like it was important to look at those movements in the context of today, and found and developed new techniques of presenting, where you all kinds of camera trickery, where you have to take a flash photograph to see the full image, and they're collages. I don't even know how to describe them myself.
But really incredible. One of the moving ones, of course, too, is the sculpture that's at the lynching museum. I don't want to call it the lynching museum, but it's a memorial. Talk to us about that image. A lot of, as I noticed in looking at your work, of the power of limbs, arms and legs, and with mostly arms, or what can be seen above.
Yeah, I think it's the gesture of reaching means a lot metaphorically, and when it comes to trying to grasp onto something that is important, or to hold it, or even things that seem out of your reach. And so in a lot of my sculptures, I especially am really fascinated with this idea of reaching, of contorting ourselves to get to the next place or to something. And that's something that I think is a metaphor for the struggle. There's also represented in the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, AKA the Lynching Memorial.
Right.
How do you see the images three-dimensional? I'm curious about that. I'm glad you asked that question, because I've been thinking about, how do you see the two-dimensional image three-dimensional?
Well, that's definitely how it started. I studied photography, and I always felt, when I looked at historical images, that I wondered what it was like to be there, and wanted to take remake an element of a photograph so I could, get a little bit closer to it, and hopefully come to a greater sense of understanding about certain things.
Right. So you've got a huge project opening up next year, a tribute in Boston to MLK Jr. and Coretta Scott King, called The Embrace, and that is quite extraordinary. How many tons is it? I mean, this is a major construction piece, born out of your artistry.
Yeah, it's going to be at the Boston Common, and it's roughly 24 feet, and I don't know how tall, and maybe 30 feet wide. It's still in the process of kind of getting the final approval so that we can put such a huge landmark piece in the oldest public space in American in the country. But it's an awesome monument to not only Coretta Scott King and Dr. Martin Luther King, but also to the millions of people who, through their love for one another and themselves and their community, have been pushing this country and the world in a direction that is bringing more of us together than ever.
So Deborah, this family you've created, truly incredible. Hank is married to Rebecca Hockley, who was a curator at the Whitney. She was on the show when she was expecting your granddaughter, and now you're telling me that she's 2 already. Deborah, talk to us about this, lineage of, and now your husband was also a jazz musician, so I should say, that everybody in the family is artistic and talented. What do you have to say about creating not only the photography, but the artists?
Right. I think living in the legacy of my parents and Hank's grandparents, that we love gatherings and holding on to the gatherings through reimagining and telling stories. Central, like you are surrounded by books. We were surrounded by their tales, not of woe, but their tales of joy. My parents, when they talked about my father migrated from Virginia to Philadelphia, But when my mother was born in Philadelphia, but when they talk about the Depression, it wasn't depressed. It talked about their ingenuity, how they were able to make pies, sell pies, how they were able to find work in different places. And I think that sparked my imagination because I was always seated at the feet of one person or the other telling their story. My great grandfather talked about back in '98. So I'm like thinking to him, like '98. He said, "Yeah, we were fighting the Spanish-American War." I had no idea that he was there, and I found that out when I was a teenager.
Right.
But to listen to their stories and their stories of determination about not only survival but about living and representing in different ways, and that's, I think, was central. I really believe that was central in rooting my interest into the arts.
Well, we want to thank both of you so much for creating the art and interpreting our history and making us all understand that we are beautiful. You both are contributing so much, all things being equal. And the Confederate, the Black Civil War soldier, 2 books of many, and much artwork. We thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
And thank you all for watching.
Yeah,
I'm Carol Jenkins. The show is Black America, and we will see you the next time.